Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. I'm Samia Aziz, celebrating the power of literature and the voices of authors and changemakers from the global majority. Join me as we explore the stories that inspire, connect, and transform our world. Let's uncover the stories that truly matter together. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by the award-winning writer and journalist Omar El Akkad. Omar is a journalist and novelist whose work masterfully blurs the lines between fiction and reality, forcing us to confront the most urgent issues of our time. His debut novel, American War, was a haunting and unflinching look at climate change, war, and displacement. His second novel, What Strange Paradise, won the Giller Prize and offered a deeply human perspective on the refugee crisis. And now, with his latest book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, he turns his attention to the genocide in Gaza, to power, identity, and the way history remembers or erases those who resist. In this conversation, we talk about the stories behind his stories, the historical and political forces that shape his work, the deeply personal nature of writing about conflict and displacement at the time it's happening, and how writing can help us make sense of an increasingly fractured world. We also explore themes of belonging, compassion, and what it means to be on the margins of history. Omar's writing is urgent, lyrical, and deeply compassionate, and I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. So let's dive in. Omar, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's such an honor to have you on the show. How are you doing?
The honor is all mine. I am jet lagged like you would not believe. I woke up at 2 a.m. today, as I have done for the last few days. But very excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Your first, I guess, non-fiction debut book is in my hands at the moment, and it's called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. But this is your first debut non-fiction book, although you are a journalist, so you've written a few fiction novels and pieces before. So I'm really interested to know, so you are by profession a journalist, which is very much about being objective, it's very much about facts, but you also write fiction and novels. So what do you think really is the role of storytelling when it comes to shaping public perception of what's going on around the world, or even about anything that you're interested in talking about?
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I used to have this default answer for sort of the difference between storytelling and nonfiction and fiction, and this idea that fiction was very much about questions, that you don't expect answers when you go into fiction. You sit with questions, or at least that's why I turn to fiction. It's when I have questions that I don't have answers for. And nonfiction, particularly journalism, is very much about answers. Who, what, where, when, how, that sort of thing. But I think in the case of this book in particular, and I'm not saying it's a good book, or I can't assess my own writing along those axes by any stretch. The way I was thinking about storytelling in terms of what it does to people, or what it might have a chance of doing, I was thinking about all this research I've seen on how if you log into Facebook or Instagram or any piece of software, there's all these settings that you can change, and the research regularly suggests that whatever the default settings are when you log in, something like 70% of people never change them. The default remains. And so that's why a lot of these companies by default will switch it to, yes, give all my information to advertisers, that sort of thing. And narratively, I think something similar happens all the time, and human beings are deeply susceptible to it, which is this notion of there being a default narrative. And if you fall outside of that, or whatever the narrative has to say about you, you're kind of stuck, right? I mean, I don't think I need to explain this to you. I say this as a guy named Omar Muhammad Laed, who's a Muslim dude living in the West, right? There's a default narrative, and it very much limits me in a million different conscious and subconscious ways. There's a reason I am one of the most deferential, conflict-averse people you will ever meet, is because I know you hit you hit a certain level of being, unfriendly, angry, antagonistic, and the default narrative has a lot to say on what you're capable of doing and sort of what you're believed to be capable of doing. So I tend to try and write in the hopes that I can switch some of those settings and somehow provide something of a non-default narrative in this part of the world anyway. That's not to say I've succeeded at it in any stretch of the imagination, but that's sort of how I approach the task of storytelling, in the hopes of changing someone's mind, or in the hopes of at least getting to think about something that previously they might have had the privilege to not think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really, I think in all of your work really comes across this challenging of, the single narrative and almost like the objectiveness when it comes to talking about anything really, but especially when it comes to talking about groups of people or experiences. And this book, I feel like, this is nonfiction. And so when we think of nonfiction, we always think like, okay, facts and research, but also what feeds into that is personal stories and personal experiences and also collective memory. And I think especially when we look at what's been happening in Gaza and we look at the people of Palestine more generally, that collective memory is so important because of all of these acts of erasure that we see happening also. But I wonder, sort of, as a journalist, like, how do you balance that? Because my assumption is that professionally your job is to present fact. It's not necessarily about presenting opinion or heartfelt stories, although obviously that does come into journalism for sure. But how do you balance that sort of need to push also collective memory and personal stories?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. I think there's two parts of it, and I'll try to tackle sort of both parts, and I apologize for the somewhat disjointed answer. But in the sense of this idea of objectivity and neutrality, that entire model makes perfect sense if we are working on an even playing field, if everybody is operating in good faith. You and I have a disagreement on how nice it is outside. It is perfectly valid for a journalist to present your side of the argument and present my side of the argument and be this kind of overarching neutral referee / scribe / scorekeeper, right? Fantastic. We don't live in that world. I often go back to this example of one of the lawmakers we have in the US where I live, who has previously mused about this idea that wildfires are caused by secret Jewish space lasers. You're going to put that in the paper, and then you're going to get an expert on space lasers to say this is patently deranged. Or when someone just lies to your face. I mean, journalism has a very hard time with lies, by which I mean not just information that is not factual, but information presented with the intent to deceive. And so if we are all operating in good faith, this would be a perfectly fine model. I have no problem with objectivity and neutrality as the highest calling of journalism. It works really well if you're telling me the score of the football game. I don't necessarily want a reporter who says, in my opinion, it was 2-1 Manchester. I get it. But we don't live in that world, right? And so I think for its own sake, as a matter of sort of, as an existential matter in terms of the trust of your readership or your viewership or whoever it is that's putting the lights on, a media organization needs to figure out how it's going to deal with lies and how it's going to deal with obvious bad faith, because the system as it stands simply doesn't work for so many of the worst things we do to one another. In terms of that idea of memory, I tend to think of sort of arenas of battle. Whenever there's injustice, there is an arena of battle because somebody is having injustice done to them and they are resisting it in some way. Some of those arenas are incredibly asymmetric. The arena of violence. In the arena of violence, the state wields so much more power. They don't just have all the guns, they also have narrative justification for any amount of violence. And, I call myself a pacifist, and I could sit here for hours and tell you how much all violence is bad, and I may believe that. but by virtue of what my tax dollars are being spent on, I'm one of the most violent human beings on earth. So my argument against violence is not only a moral one, it's predicated on the sheer asymmetry of that arena. There are other arenas, though, where the asymmetry between communal solidarity and the state are inverted. Joy is one of them. The state has no idea what to do with joy. You read these stories all the time of Palestinian hostages and prisoners being released and being told, don't smile, don't show any expression of joy. That is an asymmetric arena. And so you brought up memory. Memory, for me, is another asymmetric arena. You can raise the neighborhoods to the ground. You can end entire bloodlines. You can do all of this horrific work. But everybody knows that memory outlasts that kind of violence. And so to me, the way I think about it is that as one of the many arenas of resistance available to anyone, literally anyone, in the face of injustice, particularly when that injustice is carried out by any entity, state, corporate, whatever, that has an overwhelming amount of power.
Yeah, I really, something you just said about how, you are a pacifist and you can talk all day basically about how you are against violence, but actually like your taxes alone don't reflect that. You are a US taxpayer and I'm a UK taxpayer. My taxes also make me complicit. But there's so many other ways that we are complicit in awful things that are happening around the world in foreign policy. And you talk about it in the book with regards to the way that you sound, essentially your American accent. And I often feel so uncomfortable with this too, with my British accent, because I feel like, especially me, like not only is my accent British, but it's Southern, and that North-South divide, the associations with pronouncing words in a certain way, the privilege that comes with that. Although I am a brown Muslim, visibly Muslim woman, the privilege is also very much there. But you talk about it beyond privilege, which is complicity, and actually how so many millions and millions of ordinary people who could, like you and I, consider ourselves activists and allies and on the right side of history, but that was still contributing or benefiting without fully realizing it to things like what's happening in Gaza or in Sudan or in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I wondered if you could just talk about that. What do we do about this complicity?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I spend a lot of the book essentially contending with it and finding no safe harbor because, I sound the way I do, you sound the way you do, and that's the function of the kind of upbringing we've had and our orientation, right? We're oriented towards this part of the world. And I often, when I'm in this situation, and I'm rarely in this situation, where I'm talking to someone who knows what it's like, I often wish that we could create a little psychology experiment based on this podcast where we get two groups of individuals, one of whom listens to exactly what we've been talking about, but doesn't see our faces and doesn't know what our names are, and another group that does, and just see what their reactions to the exact same opinions are. Because I quite often, living where I do, am quite cognizant that I'm carrying around and have to preemptively prepare for a number of different versions of me based on who I'm talking to and what facet of my identity that they've decided to latch onto. Because I get treated very differently depending on whether the first thing someone latches onto is my name or my religion or my accent, or the books I've written. Those are entirely different people, and they are phantom people. They are people of that person's imagination, and I can't imagine how much more intense that is for you, right? You have to prepare for it. You don't know what's coming, right? And so sometimes, when I write about these things, there's an impression in the West that I'm writing about how much this part of the world hates me. And, sometimes it might. I don't care. I could live in Egypt, and God knows there would be parts of that society that would hate me as well. It's more that quite often it has no idea what to do with me because there are many me's walking into the room. In terms of complicity, I mean, so much of this book, I think, I couldn't write it without assessing my own complicity in all of this. And it's not just my tax dollars, not just the fact that I'm killing those kids with complete impunity. It's that having been oriented to the heart of the empire for so long and having been rewarded for it, you are discovering in new ways, I say you, I mean me, obviously, but new ways in which you haven't shed this, no matter how much you feel a sense of guilt about it. I mean, when we talk, I find myself, for example, talking about whatever the atrocity of the day is, and I find this gravitational pull when I'm talking to people in the part of the world where I live to say, well, this could happen to you one day, right? Like, these things don't stay over there, and they don't. The drone that is murdering a child is not going to stay within the confines of children you consider subhuman. But even that argument is an appeal to the heart of empire, because essentially I'm saying, okay, it's happening to people who are subhuman right now, but don't you worry, it's coming for people who are actually human soon. And you think to yourself, like, I am this, right? I have marinated in it so long that I can't just shake it off one day. And so the difficulty for me is that I'm trying to come to terms with this, but I don't know what I'm turning to, right? I know what I'm turning away from, but I don't know what I become on the other side of this. And I think that's why there's a sense, at least for me, of incompleteness in this writing. I can't wrap it up with a nice bow. I don't know what I'm becoming.
Yeah, it is. I think, I don't know if it's like the older I get, or I don't know, it's like time passes, and I think also as so much happens globally, sitting with this sort of dichotomy, but also discomfort and rage often is really difficult, because you don't really know like what to do with it, like where to challenge it, channel it, and like how can I want to give up my privilege. I want to disassociate myself from the colonial thinking of the British Empire, and I challenge it so much. And I think learning about it and educating yourself and informing yourself is a really important way to do that. But I was born in London. I grew up in the UK. I studied at Cambridge. I feel like I've been such a, I don't know, like a part of the wallpaper of the fabric of this society. I'm so intertwined, but at the same time, I also know that this country is consistently turning its back on me, and me personally, but also people like me, whether they're here or whether they're elsewhere. And there's such a frustration with that, and I feel like it's only going to get worse for future generations. And you write in the book, as we've said, like it's very personal. It's full of personal essays. You write in the book as a father, as talking about looking at your children and hopeful about the upbringings that they're going to have, but also the sort of the contrast with the time that you're spending with your kids and how you're looking at them, and also what we're seeing happen to children around the world. What do you really think that future generations will be thinking about? And how can we right now, I guess, sort of like aid this new generation growing up to not feel so disillusioned? Because, I feel like that's the overwhelming feeling right now.
Yeah, it's a big question, right? Because whenever I talk to people about any of these issues, and obviously I've talked to, I don't see a lot of people. I live out in the middle of the woods, and I've talked more this week during the book tour than I think I have in the last year. But the central ideological divide in terms of urgency, not just with respect to the slaughter in Gaza, but also climate change, and wealth disparity, and the sense that we've mortgaged the future to the hilt for my Amazon packages to arrive 15 minutes earlier. The sense of just sheer stupidity in the name of convenience. The divide isn't ideological, isn't primarily ideological. When I talk to people, it's not conservative liberal, it's not religious, it's not ethnic, it's generational. When I was talking to folks older than me about writing this book, the default answer was, hey, you shouldn't do that. Please don't. There's people who learned to normalize and sort of look away from certain things, and that was ingrained now. There was no changing it. And when I talk to younger folks, this is the quaintest, tamest thing. For them, it's just like, yeah, congratulations, you showed up, you know. I think there's an immense amount of anger among younger people who realize, I think, that their futures have been put as down payment on a world where, you know, Jeff Bezos has a slightly larger mega yacht and that we've gone beyond the bounds of traditional wealth disparity, which has been around for a very long time, to something existential, to the possibility that the earth could become uninhabitable. And that induces a kind of anger that I can only begin to imagine. And so I think my obligations, and this is not a sufficient list by any stretch of the imagination, but when I think of my obligations to that generation, because I used to be that kid where somebody would show up to the high school and say, I'm so sorry we screwed this up, but your generation is going to be the one to fix it. And now I'm that idiot who shows up to the high school and says, look, I'm really sorry, but your generation. My obligations, first and foremost, is restitution and penance to this generation for allowing this to be the case. And secondly, I think that whatever I can do to provide a little bit of preemptive yelling on their behalf, and this is where it intersects with being a writer. You know, I often talk about Hemingway's iceberg advice of like, you show a tiny bit of the story and 7/8 of it you keep to yourself, and all of that show don't tell type MFA advice. And that's great when you've had the Victorians yelling on your behalf for a really long time. You know, when the canon has been built to serve you and has been shaped to serve you, and you can withhold and you can do all of that great writing stuff that creates the literature we love so much. If you haven't been accepted by that canon, if your story hasn't been deemed worthy of inclusion in that sort of container of stories that are worth telling, that's a much harder piece of advice to follow. And so I am quite happy to play a small role in being some future generation's Victorians. That's fine by me. Because these folks have been dealt an incredibly bad hand through no fault of their own and through every fault of my generation and the generations before me. So I do think of it in those terms, but that by no means is an exhaustive list of my obligations to these people.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously this book hopefully is gonna be a small, if we think about the larger picture, a small way that, you know, you do show that our generation is showing up and trying to add something to the narrative and shift the narrative. And the title of the book is One Day Everyone Will Have Been Against This, but there's a longer quote on the front, which is, one day, when it's safe, when there's no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, when it's too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will have always been against this. And I think it's just, it's very beautiful, but it's also just saying the words, I can feel the anger bubbling up inside my chest, because it has felt for this entire year from October 2023 until today that how is it that right now not everybody is against this, and that of course in years to come everyone is going to be against this. Nobody is ever going to look back and say that this was justified, the absolute slaughter and bloodshed that's happening. And I guess, this is, the historians will call it, a revisionist approach to history, where people will retrospectively say, no, but we were always against it. We were always on the right side of history. Can you talk a little bit on this title? Why did you decide to call the book this, and what does it really mean?
Yeah, so in October of 2023, I'm not a particularly active person on social media. I've never been, and I've essentially stopped using it as of late. I don't go on there anymore, but in October of 2023, I posted essentially a tweet with the full block of text that you read. And I didn't think much of it. It seemed to me, this is a stupid thing to say about your own words, but it seemed uncontroversial to me. Of course, I'm sure that wasn't the case. But for some reason, it got some traction, and that was the end of it. I didn't think too much about it. I have trouble making a big deal out of social media, even though that is the platform through which a lot of information gets out before it's sort of filtered or suppressed in some way. And then I started writing the book independent of that in November. And it was only after the first draft was completed many months later that one of my editors suggested that we use that title, that we repurpose that quote as a title. And so now I'm on this very sort of futile tour where I try to convince people that I didn't just take a tweet and expand it out to 250 pages. I promise you that's not how that played out. For me, I mean, it's not a triumphant statement. It's in fact quite the opposite. It's going to be an incredibly sad day when we get to a place where that has been established, right? Because it's a parachute, right, for people who don't deserve a narrative parachute. In polite society, and maybe that'll change under Trump, who the hell knows, but in polite society, you really can't find too many people who will tell you that they were always pro-South African apartheid. Clearly there were. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. Same with segregation, same with slavery, same with virtually every mass historical wrong that had a side benefit for a powerful group of human beings. Or for any group of human beings, to be perfectly honest. And I don't see this being different, but I think that sometimes when I talk to people about this title, I get the sense that, and I don't think this is the case here, but I get the sense that they thought I meant 2 weeks from now. And I don't. I will be very, very lucky if I live an average lifespan for this part of the world to see this during my lifetime, I think. Because as much as we have these narrative frameworks that start at the first horrible thing the wrong group of people did, this has been going on for the better part of a century. And so to me, there are two things that come to mind when I think of the title of this book. The first is that in my mind, I was working on the same time frames as, for example, with the genocide of the indigenous population of North America, where the U.S. government issued a proclamation apologizing for it a few years ago. And the second is that when that day comes, I'm not going to be running around the streets celebrating how prophetic I am, or I don't care in the slightest. It's a deeply damning statement about the kind of human beings we are and the kind of societies we've built, that I, the most insecure, indecisive person you will ever meet, am so certain that that moment is coming.
Yeah. And like I said to you as well, like just saying those words, like I could feel like the rage just building up, because it's so rage inducing. Not that like it's not that like it's not necessarily that I'm angry that it's not happening right now, although I am angry that it's not happening right now. It's more that it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. And actually the hardest thing is that there are so many people that continue to benefit from it, that are adamant that they're going to cause destruction. And that is what I think is so frustrating, is that those people will continue to do it probably for years to come, because although there has been a ceasefire called a few weeks ago, that doesn't mean anything. And actually the statements that have been coming out from Trump and elsewhere are really terrifying about what could be coming next. It feels like, we end one stage or one episode of the slaughter and we go on to something that's potentially even more darker. And actually on that, your fiction work is often a little bit trippy, I like to call it. Like, it's a little bit like you imagine futures often, and these are dark and weird and horrible futures, which I think is, makes complete sense if we look at what current day life is. And often I think that, actually we don't even need dystopian literature as much anyway, because it feels like we're living in a dystopia. The things that we thought would never happen are happening right now. Why do you think talking about issues or presenting stories in this sort of dystopian fiction way is a powerful way to do so.
I mean, I was born in a part of the world where the governments have been, at least for the duration of my lifetime, incredibly repressive. And part of that is the after effects of colonialism and the kind of cruelty that becomes ingrained. On the other side of that, part of that is the nature of authoritarianism. Part of that is we've just had garbage governments in so much of the Arab world for so long. But as a result of that, particularly in the literary traditions, I think we've become quite good, and our authors have become quite good at sneaking in through the door, pretending to write about one thing and actually writing about another. You know, the most famous example is probably Naguib Mahfouz, who wrote this book, Wilad Haritna, Children of Our Alley, or I don't know how it's translated in English, but for the longest time, that book was thought to be just a story about a bunch of alley kids in a neighborhood in Egypt. And then somebody realized much later on that it was an allegory for the prophets of the Abrahamic religions. And Naguib Mahfouz eventually was stabbed in the neck for the, you know, the crime of heresy or whatever. But that sense of trickery, and you see it more recently with like Basma Abdelaziz, for example, who writes, you know, novels about a government, and everybody knows what she's talking about, and an attempt at a revolution, and everybody knows what she's, you know, there's different levels of masking or unmasking, but that sense of I need to sneak something by you is sort of ever present. And I don't do it nearly as well, but God, I try. You know, there's a segment in the middle of American War, my debut novel, that takes place in a refugee camp for displaced Americans. And it's called Camp Patience, and almost everything that happens in that section is based almost verbatim at some point on the massacre in Sabra and Shatia, the Palestinian refugee camp, where, you know, 40 some years ago there was this massacre. And, you know, Sabr is the Arabic word for patience, and so there are, but nobody on this side of the world, you know, at least where I live, has any idea what the hell I'm talking about. And they're not taught this stuff in high school. They don't. And so, you know, I try for this kind of inversion and this kind of hiding. And the downside, of course, is that everybody picks up American War and assumes that it is a book about America. It's got American in the title. It can't be somebody else's story superimposed on the empire. It can't be that, you know. But that's the approach. I mean, that's the avenue of entry for me into the world of dystopia or into the world of speculative fiction. I'm never thinking when I'm putting these books together, how do I make this as dark as possible? How do I create the vibe so that, you know, people want to make a movie out of this and it'll look cyberpunky? And that stuff doesn't factor into my thinking at all. It might end up as a sort of side effect, but I don't care. I very much am interested in the work of inversion, because quite often I find myself in these conversations related to the slaughter in Iraq during the war on terror, or in Afghanistan, or what's currently happening in Gaza, where somebody from this part of the world will ask me, well, what do we do? What's the solution here? And I always say, you know, I have a PhD in absolutely nothing, but if I'm thinking of a prerequisite for a solution, pretend these people were human to you. Pretend it was happening to people who are close to you, who you don't think of as distant others. And so how do I approach that in the writing? Well, in the case of American War, I'm going to place it on top of you, and I'm going to pretend it's you. So that's how I get into that. But of course, you come to expect the natural sort of counter to that, which is the review that says I'm being too dark and hopeless, and you know, it's a bummer. And I get it. I get all of that. But at least consider the possibility that I am trying to get you to think about someone who you otherwise had the privilege to look away from. And this is the trick I'm using to do it.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And it's got me thinking also, not just about like tools and I guess like tricks to get people thinking about things, but also just language in general. And obviously, like as a journalist, you'll know this probably more than anyone, that the words that you choose to label something or describe something change its meaning massively. And not just its meaning, but it changes everybody's else's relationship to that, whether that means that you have an obligation to act, or whether it means that you're involved, or whether it means that you're completely separated from it. But it changes it entirely. And you write in the book as well that I really appreciated it, the hesitancy that people and authorities have actually to use the word genocide. And you wrote about how actually people have been offended that in very early on in late 2023 that the word genocide was being used by masses of people to describe what was going on, because they felt, whether or not we understand the historical definition or whatever of the word genocide, there was nothing else to describe what was actually taking place. But there was such a hesitancy because once you use the word genocide, there is an obligation to act. And not just on an individual level, but on an international community, political level, there's an obligation to do something to stop this. But we've seen countless time and time again, just the sheer sort of incorrect, biased media reporting and the selective use of language. How have you navigated that in your work, and why do you think it's so important that we continue to call the thing that it actually is, instead of finding more palatable ways to describe it, even if that means we could perhaps engage people that are somewhat on the fence or whatever it may be?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I'm now in the thick of this book tour, at least in the UK, and so that means a lot of interviews, right? And I shouldn't be surprised, I suppose, but a lot of the time in those interviews has been spent on debate over words, right? And chief among those words is the word genocide, and I get that, right? I understand that. One of the really interesting things to me is, of course, the reticence is related to the obligation to act. It's a switch that you flip that once you do, you have to decide whether you are effectively a nation state of your word or not. Because there is a general agreement that the point of calling something genocide is not to do so and then walk away and wipe your hands of it. But what has been really interesting to me is that as you have people who from the get-go knew what this was and called it out as such, and not a small group of people. I understand when we talk about this that there's the thought that, it's a bunch of Arabs and Muslims who are standing up for Arabs. I get it, whatever. This, I think, is a function of the warping prism of this incredibly asymmetric power structure, right? People around the world are horrified by this. Not because everybody loves Arabs and Muslims, not because we're this beloved group that never has any trouble. It's because people have a conscience and people have eyes. And they see what is happening and are horrified by it. And that horror, falls on deaf ears in the power structures in the part of the world that could stop this with a single phone call. But over time, you start watching not, committed Western institutions committed to Zionism or deeply anti-Palestinian or whatever, but like human rights groups slowly start to back into a corner where they have no choice but to call this a genocide. And you get these incredibly delicately worded reports saying, look, because of this and because of that, and in a normal world, that's how you should approach it. This is not a small charge to make. But I don't think this is happening because these organizations are surgical about their word choice. I think they've been embarrassed by such a deluge of evidence that they can no longer call themselves human rights organizations and continue turning away from this. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a very depressing thing, because these are the organizations where, when you're completely fed up of the institutional power centers of the part of the world you live in, you turn to those, right? Those are supposed to be the ones that say, to hell with this, we're going to call it as it is. And instead you get this sort of backing into it. And it's not as though the language that follows the language of defining something as genocide is unknown to these power centers. You can look up all kinds of tweets in statements from Hillary Clinton condemning in the strongest possible terms Russia's bombing of a hospital in Ukraine. People know a thing when they see it and when there's no external pressure to not see it. So this, I mean, as depressing as it is, this essential sort of autopsy of language that we've been subjected to over the last year and a half has been, among many other terrible things, deeply instructive about what happens when a population considered subhuman is subjected to the sort of things that we have created all kinds of treaties and organizations and stopgap measures and permanent measures precisely to stop.
Yeah. And I mean, I really feel it when you say like it is depressing. Like it is so depressing, because sometimes it also just feels like, well, what's taking you so long? You know, I feel like there are more and more things coming out. This UN agency or this human rights group or whatever, slowly people are calling it what it is, which is a genocide. And like you said, they are doing it softly, but also in a way that feels a little bit self-congratulating, that, oh, we've reached this conclusion and we're certain that this is what it is and we're horrified by it. But, you know, not only are we talking about the last year and a half, but this is, as you said, close to a century of what's been going on. And, you know, maybe if in the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s, had there been mobile phones in the way that we have them today, had there been storytelling, had there been independent media and social media for all of its flaws, things would have been very different. Would we have reached this conclusion sooner? And I say we, not to include everybody, but, you know, the wider we. And it just, there is something very, I think, frustrating at just how slow that is. And you know, like, history does tell us this repeatedly, that it can take 100 or 150 years. I think the sort of the freedom of Algeria from France, I think, took over 150 years. Like, this is what we see, but when you're living that, like, I won't be around in 150 years. I want to see it in my lifetime. And yeah, that's really, really very difficult. And I think also this idea, you know, for so many of us, the past year and a half has been about bearing witness. And obviously, like, that doesn't mean that we only bear witness. Again, coming with bearing witness is to do something with the things that you have witnessed, to allow it to inform your everyday life choices, to allow it to inform your activism, and even, you know, who you vote for, if you vote at all. But, you know, it's not an easy thing to sit with also. There's a lot of frustrations, obviously a huge amount of limitation with just sitting and bearing witness. But I wondered if you could speak on this idea of bearing witness, because often that is the only thing that we can do. And obviously as a journalist, although you report, you also, you bear witness to everything going on.
Yeah, there was a part of me that when I was writing this book was thinking, what is this going to do? I talked at the very beginning of our conversation about this idea of changing people's minds. I have a very strange relationship with that concept, because when I'm writing, I have to believe that I can change people's minds and that I can change the world and all the rest of it, knowing full well that the likelihood is almost exclusively that none of that is going to happen. And you have to sort of delude yourself into it. But it's almost a testament to this point you brought up, which I think is an excellent point about the negative space of history. You know, you watch something like this because a journalist in Palestine has risked their lives to get that footage out or to get that audio out or whatever it may be, and in many cases have lost their lives as a result, not simply for being there, but in some cases as direct retaliation for doing it. And then you can't help but think that maybe, you know, cops didn't start shooting black people the day the cell phone camera was invented. And the magnitude of that once you start to extrapolate, can be absolutely crushing. The magnitude of everything we didn't see. And usually in this part of the world, the privilege exists to not think about that, to not think about the things you don't have to think about. And now suddenly all of that is blown apart because a fundamental part of not looking away from this is realizing how much you are able to look away from otherwise. And so in that sense, I think I talk about it early on in the book, the most pathetic and yet necessary function of literature is witness. So much of this stuff is going to be memory hold. And you see that every day across the board, not just in this situation, but all of these companies where I live in the US who suddenly pretend that they never had diversity policies or delete the page for Black History Month and power told them to, right? The utter spinelessness of that is a pretty good indicator of how easily our institutions can engage in this incredibly violent forgetting. And so I think the very least we can do is try to stand in the way of that. This book does that in the most sort of pathetic way. Chiefly, this is being done by Palestinians themselves. And this, I think, relates to another factor that we almost never talk about because we're playing from such a disadvantage where let's just try and stop the killing becomes, an overarching concern because it's the most necessary one. But it's not an exclusive one, right? On the other side of that is some kind of accountability, right? The Hind Rajab Foundation is doing the kind of work that I think if you are invested in empire, you find particularly destructive. You find particularly dangerous because it involves the simple statement that when somebody does something horrific, they should be held to account for it, which should be the basis of all of our laws, right? Of everything we do as a society if we are going to call ourselves civilized. And yet trying to apply that in positions of asymmetric power suddenly induces a kind of rage that many of these power centers are unable to muster at the sight of a dead child. And that tells me that something very, very diseased is at the center of so many of our power structures. I can't fix that tomorrow. None of us can. But we have a kind of solidarity these systems don't. And again, we have memory, right? So that's how I think about it. I think there are times when I think it's the very absolute least I could do when people are, going into a killing field to perform surgery on children and they are standing in the way, shutting down train stations and stopping weapons shipments from leaving the port and doing all of this incredibly courageous stuff. And I'm sitting in a room in the woods, hammering away on the keyboard. It feels so pathetic. And yet it is part of an effort, I think, to simply say, this is what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, I don't know if it's fortunate or if it's unfortunate, but I do think that in the years to come, like soon, in the next 5 years, I feel like the literature that we're going to see on what's happened in the last year and a half is just it's going to be huge. And it's going to be written from a whole range of people. Some of those voices we really don't need to hear from anymore, but some of them will be very, very powerful. We know a lot of Palestinian journalists are being supported and getting their work out there, which is absolutely amazing. But your book, you started writing it at the end of 2023, and I'm guessing it took you a few months into 2024. By the time you finished writing it, there was still so much happening in Gaza, in around the world. What was that like? Because the book's come out now, and like I've said, it's been a few weeks since a ceasefire has been called, and there's still awful stuff happening. But you didn't have it wasn't like you were looking back on a year and a half of violence at that point. It was just the start. What was it like, I guess, that sort of, the experience of writing at that stage, and then I guess being done with your transcript and your copy and still so much stuff happening? Did you feel the sense of like, oh, maybe if I'd have waited, I could have included more stuff? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I was rewriting this book to the very end. I was recording the audiobook and I was making changes as I was recording, which, if anyone's involved in publishing, knows that publishing houses don't like that.
That's not really allowed, yeah.
Yeah, it's not a great idea. There were several reasons that I was rewriting. One of them, perhaps the chief reason, is that there were things that were presented to me as facts that eventually came out to be complete lies. And again, this goes back to when we were talking about journalism earlier, right? I'm a human being who is naturally inclined to take people in good faith, right? At the beginning of this conversation, before we started recording, when we were asking each other where we were, and you told me the town you were in, my first instinct was like, oh, she's in that town. Not, oh my God, could she be lying to me? Like, it's just a natural human impulse to believe in good faith. And of course, in hindsight, that's an incredibly naive thing, because you're not dealing with somebody telling you their hometown. You're dealing with a nation state actor and systems of power. And it's incredibly embarrassing that I would sort of take that mode into a work like this. But I was rewriting it constantly. Line edits, paragraph edits, changes. And I would continue doing that. If this book hadn't been pulled out of my hands and actually sent physically to be printed, because that's what needs to happen, I would continue doing that endlessly. I mean, we had a situation that is the exact example of what I'm talking about last week, right? With relation to this, Hannibal directive. And again, and this was an Israeli minister sort of declaring this. And again, when I say that, I find myself returning to that idea of how complicit I am in empire, because effectively I'm saying, yeah, Palestinians said it before, but now somebody who matters has said it. So you must believe, I'm falling into those patterns. But I was making those changes all of the time. And yet at a sort of thematic, overarching level, there's not much I would change. I think that, I don't think this book is going to be remembered, but if it is remembered, I think it's eventually going to be remembered as one of the quaintest, tamest examples of its kind. I'm not the only person who has been broken by watching a year and a half of children getting murdered, right? And that body of work, I think, is going to be so much better and so much more direct and necessary than anything I wrote in this book. It's coming. It's on its way. The only sort of remotely unique thing about this work is that it showed up so early. And that's as a function of again, if you were around in October and November, you knew in some way what was coming and what was happening in that moment. But yeah, I think in another setting, I would continue making those small changes, because I think the compendium of lies is far from complete. But one of the things about the last, this stretch, whatever, year and a half, is that for better or worse, everybody is showing you exactly who they are. You read this book, you might think it's a complete pile of garbage, but I'm showing you who I am, for better or worse, right? I think it's difficult to read that and think, he doesn't believe this stuff, And I think across the board, the one thing we all have in common is that this moment has forced us to show who we really are.
Yeah. And, I just, I want to say, I think there's something really special about when this book was written, because for so many of us, the beginning of the last 18 months, when we didn't know for sure what was going to happen, but we kind of knew very early on that this is not going to end in a couple of weeks. So many of us, I think we were gripped by fear of not just uncertainty, but we'd already seen so many horrors, and just knowing that it could get so much worse. I think there's something really profound in capturing that sense that so many people did have during that time as well, because it's very easy, I think, to look back at the last 18 months as something that had happened, but it's okay because now there's a ceasefire. Now we move on to the next phase, whatever that is, and that will require different things of us, and that will mean that different things are happening. But there is something really important in understanding what individuals and what the movement and what people did during these 18 months and how that changed, but also that very sort of personal experience of, oh my gosh, what do I do with all of this stuff? How is this making me feel? And obviously, like, our feelings don't matter in the grand scheme of things, but it does matter in terms of how it informs how we show up. And showing up is so important. And obviously, like, this whole thing is not, fundamentally, it's about the freedom of the Palestinians and their right to life and dignity and freedom. But it does, how we show up and how we're able to do what we need to do and what is required of us is so important. And I think, I think that will really resonate with people. And I feel like it's good that it's being captured and immortalized in so many ways, because it is an incredibly strange and, I don't know, like, uncertain time where you have all of these thoughts and you have no way of knowing what's going to happen. And it's interesting, I think, to have the book somehow in hindsight, to be able to look back. It's an interesting experience, but I think, hopefully will give comfort in some ways to a lot of people like myself, who, especially those first few months, I just remember just the insomnia that came, because it was just like, what is going on and what is going to happen? And I think that it's almost like a unique angle or a unique element of the book that I think will make it stand out for sure.
Thank you for that. That's incredibly generous. I tend to think about, pattern recognition historically whenever I'm in moments like this. And fortunately, there have been plenty in my lifetime. The war in Iraq, for example, being one of the most glaring. And in that situation, you had this immense kind of silence, narratively speaking. And then when it was first pierced, it wasn't pierced in this part of the world by Iraqi writers. That came much, much later. It was pierced by those Marines who came home and then wrote short story collections about how sad it made them to kill all those brown people, right? And so there is a framework for the acceptance of narrative, but it operates along the same axis of asymmetry and power disparity as everything else. Look, with a book like this, I mean, if two people pick it up and get into a conversation about how much they despise it because of how much it gets wrong about resistance and activism, and that causes them to make a connection, hey, I'm all for it. That's worth the price of admission for me, because those people are doing the work. Like, so much of this book is about my disgust with institutions. I've been so inspired by what individuals are doing. These communities and these networks of solidarity and this incredible contagious bravery that's happening, from which I've leached so much courage that I don't have naturally. And so, there's this sense where when I wake up incredibly dejected almost every morning, because again, I often say I've been conditioned now where if I do open social media and I see a picture of a smiling Palestinian child, I've been conditioned to understand that it's probably because that kid has just been killed. It's not a morally or psychologically or socially healthy place for me or the society I live in to be. So there's lots of dejection. But we have one another. And that is, again, an arena where the power balance is asymmetric in the other direction. Institutions build these networks based on mutual self-interest and profit and all that good stuff. But not these kinds of networks. And so even though there's lots of people that, I say this in the book, there's lots of people who previously I considered friends who I'm never going to talk to again. I'm not going to rage about them on the internet. I'm not going to do any of that. There's just a leave taking. We are on opposite sides of a chasm that I can't bridge. You and I might have very different thoughts on urban design, and maybe we get into a super heated argument about whether a skyscraper should go up in this side of the city or not. Fine, great. That's a chasm I can bridge. We'll go out for dinner afterwards. It'll be great. This isn't that. But just as much as I've left people behind and people have left me behind, there are so many human beings for whom my respect has gone through the roof. And that keeps me going, because otherwise, you are left in a vacuum, and you are left not just conceding, but doing something far more cowardly than that, which is conceding on somebody else's behalf. And as much as I want to disappear into the woods and never be heard from again, I think the obligation to not do that supersedes pretty well everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think you're so right. Like, we have each other, and that, it'd be really beautiful, I think, note to end on. Omar, thank you so much for your time today. But yeah, the book is out in the world. You are currently on your UK tour, and I look forward to people picking it up and following the conversations that come from it, because I'm sure there will be many. I know you feel like this book may not be huge in the grand scheme of things, but honestly, having read it, I can say that it's pretty incredible. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for this book, and thank you for your time today.
That was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I hope you loved listening to this episode and found things that will stay with you. I'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out on social media, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review, as it can really help.